Take a look at modern Tokyo. It's a dense, neon-soaked landscape built on high-speed rail, automation, and a digital infrastructure that feels decades ahead of the rest of the world. Looking at this skyline, it's easy to assume this level of innovation has always been the norm here. But just 6 generations ago, this exact landscape was a strictly feudal society. Power was held by a military dictatorship, the borders were sealed to the outside world, and the primary symbol of authority wasn't a computer chip, it was a hand-forged steel sword. This raises a massive question. How did a secluded agrarian archipelago transition from medieval isolation to a global technological leader in less than a century? Japan's trajectory follows a rhythmic movement, behaving like a massive pendulum. It swings between long periods of deep isolation, where its culture incubates in privacy, and sudden external impacts that send a shockwave through the system, forcing hyper-accelerated change to maintain its sovereignty. To see how this cycle created the modern superpower, we have to track the pendulum back to its first significant swing. The first era of the pendulum was defined by deep prehistoric seclusion. During the Jomon and Yayoi periods, the inhabitants of these islands developed wet rice agriculture and bronze working in near total isolation from the Asian mainland. While ancient Chinese legends tell of explorers like Xu Fu searching these islands for an elixir of immortality, the real story was internal centralization. The Yamato clan rose to power, establishing an imperial line claiming direct descent from the Shinto sun goddess. This era peaked during the Heian period. Inside Kyoto's palace walls, the imperial court became an isolated bubble of high art and refined aesthetics. The nobles spent their lives obsessed with poetry and calligraphy, leaving the actual governance of the rugged provinces to others. Because the central government was so focused on art, wealthy landowners in the countryside had to hire their own protection. They built private armies of professional warriors who followed a strict code of martial honor. These were the samurai, and they eventually grew so powerful that they replaced the court as the true rulers of Japan. This martial society faced its first true external shock in the late 13th century. Kublai Khan, having already conquered China, launched 2 massive Mongol invasion fleets aimed directly at the Japanese coast. The samurai fought with desperate ferocity, but the invasion was ultimately halted by a pair of massive typhoons that destroyed the Mongol ships. The Japanese called these kamikaze, or divine winds. However, the cost of defending the islands bankrupted the government. Without land or loot to pay the samurai, the central authority collapsed, plunging Japan into over a century of civil war. While the Mongol threat was repelled, it left a fractured society. To prevent that kind of internal collapse from happening again, the nation's next set of rulers pushed the pendulum toward the most extreme lockdown in history. After decades of war, 3 successive leaders managed to unify the country. The last of them, Tokugawa Ieyasu, secured his rule at the Battle of Sekigahara and moved the seat of power to a small fishing village called Edo, the city we now call Tokyo. To keep a tight lid on the country, the shogunate enforced the Sakoku policy. For 250 years, Japan was a closed box. No one was allowed to leave, almost no one was allowed in, and the penalty for breaking these rules was death. The pendulum was effectively frozen. This era of seclusion led to a massive cultural incubation. With no wars to fight, the samurai became scholars and bureaucrats. A unique urban culture flourished, giving the world haiku poetry, kabuki theater, and the highly detailed woodblock prints that would later influence global art. The bubble burst in 1853 when Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy arrived with a fleet of steam-powered, heavily armed black ships. These ships were a massive technological shock to a nation that hadn't seen a significant military advancement in 2 centuries. Realizing they were helpless against Western technology, the Japanese government was overthrown in the Meiji Restoration. Within a single generation, they dismantled the feudal system, built a national railway, and industrialized their entire economy to ensure they could never be bullied by a foreign power again. This forced modernization did more than just protect Japan. It turned a previously isolated island nation into an aggressive player on the global stage. With its new industrial muscles, Japan began to expand. They defeated the Chinese in the 1890s and later seized control of the Korean peninsula, governing it with a militarized police force that siphoned food and resources back to the Japanese home islands. By the 1930s, this expansion turned into a full-scale invasion of mainland China. The Japanese military's push through the continent was marked by extreme violence, including the massacre in Nanjing, where hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed or abused, in one of history's darkest chapters. As Japan pushed deeper into Asia, the United States responded by cutting off their supply of oil and steel, the lifeblood of a modern military. Faced with a choice between halting their expansion or seizing new oil fields by force, Japan chose to strike. On December 7, 1941, they launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor to clear the U.S. Navy out of the Pacific. The U.S. industrial machine recovered with speed, crushing the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Midway and beginning a brutal island-hopping campaign. U.S. forces pushed through every stronghold, eventually surrounding the Japanese home islands and cutting them off from all outside supplies. Despite having no Navy or Air Force left, the Japanese leadership refused to surrender. This total deadlock set the stage for the absolute most powerful external shock the world had ever seen. In August 1945, the United States deployed atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The explosions reached temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun, instantly erasing entire city centers and forcing an unconditional surrender. Japan was left in absolute ruin. Hundreds of thousands were dead, the industry was gone, and the imperial system that had driven the nation for centuries was dismantled overnight by an occupying U.S. military. But here, the pendulum swung again. Stripped of its military, the nation channeled its culture of discipline and organization entirely into civilian rebuilding. They didn't just reconstruct what was lost, they designed an entirely new national identity. Supported by global investments, Japan underwent a period of growth that outpaced every other nation. They moved from producing cheap textiles to dominating the world's automobile and consumer electronics markets in just a few decades. By the 1980s, the nation that had been a leveled ruins 40 years earlier was leading global markets in high-precision robotics and semiconductor manufacturing. They had taken the momentum from their total defeat and used it to propel themselves into the future. Japan represents a cycle of recovery, where existential threats and total destruction have served as the fuel for its subsequent eras. It's a nation defined by its ability to absorb a shock and then use that force to swing the pendulum even further into the future.